The first light of dawn crept over the desert, spilling gold across the horizon and turning the sand into a sea of quiet fire. The air was cold, the kind that bit into the skin and reminded a man he was still alive. Near the edge of a dried-up riverbed stood a lone cowboy, his hat pulled low against the wind, his coat torn at the shoulder, and a rifle slung across his back. His horse shifted restlessly beside him, sensing something uneasy in the morning stillness. A few paces away, bound to a wooden post with rusted chains, sat an Apache woman, wild-eyed, proud, and silent. Her wrists were raw, her face smudged with dust, yet there was a fierce kind of dignity in the way she sat upright, refusing to look afraid. The cowboy's gloved hand hesitated at his belt, his knife catching a glint of sunlight. He had been paid to deliver her to the fort, but something in her gaze, steady and burning like the desert sun, had been haunting him for days. She wasn't like the others he'd seen dragged off to trade hands between soldiers and scouts. She didn't plead, didn't curse. She just stared into the distance, as if she belonged to something greater than the men who tried to claim her. The night before, he'd barely slept. Her soft humming, low, almost like a prayer, had drifted across the firelight and unsettled him more than any battle cry. He had asked her why she wouldn't eat, why she wouldn't speak. She had only said one thing: better to starve free than live as someone's prize. Those words had cut deeper than any knife. Now, as dawn broke, he stood before her again, torn between what he was hired to do and what his conscience whispered. When he stepped closer, the woman's dark eyes lifted to meet his. They were calm, but in them flickered something dangerous, like storm clouds gathering behind a mountain ridge. "You don't belong in chains," he muttered, pulling his knife free. The sound of steel echoed in the quiet desert. For a moment she didn't move. The chains clinked softly as he knelt to cut them loose. She could have thanked him. She could have looked relieved. Instead, as the last shackle fell away, she rose slowly, her voice sharp as flint. "I'd rather die than be yours." The words hit him like a gunshot. He froze, the knife still in his hand, unsure if she meant it as a threat or a promise. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and smoke from some far-off camp. She turned her face toward the east, where the sun was rising over the canyon ridge. And for the first time, he noticed the faint scars along her wrists, the marks of long captivity. There was no fear in her, only defiance. Her pride was the kind that couldn't be bought or broken. The cowboy felt a strange ache in his chest, something between guilt and admiration. He had once believed in clear lines, right and wrong, duty and rebellion. But in that moment, watching her walk barefoot toward the light, he wasn't sure which side he stood on anymore. She moved like someone who had known loss too deep to name, yet carried it like a banner. He called out to her, his voice rough. "You'll die out there. The desert doesn't spare anyone." She stopped but didn't turn. "Neither do men," she said quietly. Then she started walking again, her figure growing smaller against the endless stretch of desert. He wanted to let her go, to ride off and forget this encounter, but something inside him wouldn't. He couldn't shake the feeling that fate had tied their paths together for a reason neither of them understood yet. By noon, the sun had burned away the cool of morning, and the land shimmered under the heat. He followed her tracks, barefoot prints pressed into the dust, steady and unhurried. She was heading north toward Apache lands, a place no white man ventured unless he had a death wish. The further he rode, the heavier his thoughts grew. He remembered the stories he'd heard around campfires, of warriors who vanished into the cliffs, of spirits said to protect their people. Maybe she believed those stories. Maybe she was one of them. Hours later, he found her again, kneeling beside a dried creek, filling her hands with sand and letting it slip through her fingers. When she heard his horse approach, she didn't flinch. "You shouldn't follow me," she said without looking up. "They'll kill you before they ask who you are." He dismounted, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. "Maybe I ain't got much left worth killing for," he said. "Maybe I just want to make sure you live long enough to see tomorrow." She laughed bitterly, a sound that carried both pain and pride. "You think I need saving? You think freedom comes from a man's mercy?" Her voice trembled, but her spirit didn't. "You know nothing of what they took from me." He lowered his eyes, unable to answer. She was right. He didn't know. All he knew was the way her words twisted something inside him, forcing him to see the world through a different lens, the kind where the lines between captor and savior began to blur. The wind shifted again, this time carrying a faint drumbeat from somewhere in the hills. She stiffened. "They're coming," she whispered. Her gaze darted toward the ridgeline. The cowboy followed her stare and saw faint silhouettes moving against the light. Riders, fast and armed. He reached for his rifle, instincts kicking in. She turned toward him, eyes fierce and steady. "If they see you with me, they'll take your scalp. And if they take you, they'll kill you," he said. Her voice softened, almost like a sigh. "Then maybe that's how it's meant to be." He looked at her, at the way the sun caught in her hair and the strength in her stance, and he realized she wasn't afraid of death. She was afraid of being owned again. The riders were closer now, the sound of hooves rumbling like thunder. He didn't know if they were friends or enemies, but he knew one thing. He couldn't hand her over. Not now. Without a word, he grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the canyon. She resisted at first, then followed, her breath quick and sharp. The two of them ran across the dry riverbed, sand flying beneath their boots. Bullets cracked in the distance, echoing off the rocks. They dove behind a cluster of boulders, hearts pounding. The woman's face was inches from his, her eyes burning with fury. "Why?" she demanded. "Why save me if I'm not yours?" He opened his mouth, but no words came. The truth was tangled in feelings he couldn't name. Guilt, respect, something deeper he dared not speak. The sun blazed above them, and the sound of riders closing in grew louder. She gripped his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Let me go," she said again, her voice trembling now, not with fear but with conviction. "If you want to live, let me go." He shook his head. "Not yet." Her eyes widened, confusion flickering across her face. "Then you're a fool." "Maybe," he said, staring out at the canyon, where danger approached like a storm. "But I ain't the kind who lets someone walk into death alone." She stared at him for a long moment, her breath ragged. Somewhere between the heat and the fear, something changed in her expression, something unspoken. Then the wind rose, carrying dust and silence between them. In that silence, only one thing was certain. The desert was about to test them both, and by the next sunrise, neither would be the same. The wind howled through the canyon like a restless spirit, carrying with it the taste of dust and danger. The cowboy pressed his back against the rock wall, his rifle gripped tight, eyes scanning the ridge above. The Apache woman crouched beside him, her breathing steady, her gaze fixed on the open stretch of sand where horsemen now appeared. Dark shapes against the rising sun. She didn't move, didn't blink, just watched them like she was measuring the distance between life and death. He could tell she'd done this before, maybe too many times. He didn't know if the riders were her people or the men who'd captured her before. Either way, they weren't coming with kind intentions. The way they rode, low, silent, with dust kicking behind them, told him they were hunters. He reached for his horse's reins, but the animal was trembling, sensing the tension. The woman turned her head slightly, her dark hair brushing her shoulder. "You shouldn't have followed me," she said in a low voice. "Now they'll think you stole me." He let out a bitter laugh. "I didn't steal you. I just couldn't let you die out here." Her eyes narrowed. Men always say that before they decide what a woman's worth. He opened his mouth to argue but stopped. She was right in a way that stung. The chains he'd cut from her wrists weren't just made of metal. They were built from years of betrayal, from men who promised mercy and delivered ruin. He wasn't sure how to make her believe he wasn't one of them. The riders halted at the mouth of the canyon. Dust rose around them, glinting like smoke in the light. The cowboy could hear the creak of saddles, the click of rifles being loaded. He'd been in shootouts before, but this felt different. These men weren't outlaws or soldiers. They were warriors, fierce and patient. He knew he didn't stand a chance if they found him. The woman slowly reached into the pouch tied around her waist. From it, she pulled a small leather charm, worn and faded. She whispered something in her native tongue, her voice calm but heavy with meaning. He didn't understand the words, but the way she said them sent a chill down his spine. "What's that?" he asked. "Protection," she replied. "If you believe, do you?" Her lips pressed together. "I used to." For a moment there was silence except for the wind and the distant cry of an eagle overhead. The cowboy's mind wandered back to the fort, the deal, the money, the orders. He'd been told the woman was dangerous, that she was the widow of an Apache war leader killed in a raid. They said she carried secrets, things the army wanted. He hadn't asked questions. He needed the pay. But now, watching her kneel and press her hand to the ground as if feeling the pulse of the earth, he began to doubt everything he'd been told. "You really think they'll kill me?" he asked quietly. Her gaze met his, sharp and certain. "If they think you took me, yes. If they think you helped me escape, worse." He swallowed hard. "Then why don't you run and tell them I forced you?" Her expression softened just barely. Because you didn't. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder. The cowboy's fingers tightened on his rifle. He could see one of the riders signaling to the others, spreading out. They were searching. His horse snorted nervously, giving away their position. He cursed under his breath. The woman's eyes flashed with urgency. "This way," she said, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward a narrow fissure in the canyon wall. He followed without question, trusting her instincts. They slipped into the shadows, squeezing through the tight passage until the sound of hooves faded behind them. The air was cooler here, thick with the smell of stone and sage. The woman stopped and pressed her ear to the rock. "They won't follow," she whispered. "They think this path leads to bad spirits." He raised a brow. "You believe in spirits?" "I believe in memory," she said. "The land remembers what men try to forget." They moved deeper until the passage opened into a hidden hollow. Sunlight poured through a crack above, lighting the place in a soft golden glow. The woman sat down on a flat stone, rubbing the marks on her wrists. The cowboy stood a few feet away, uneasy. "So what now?" he asked. She looked up at him, her face unreadable. "You'll go back to your people. Tell them you lost me. Say I ran into the hills." He shook his head. "They'll know I'm lying." "Then you'll die for nothing." He paced, frustration boiling inside him. "You think I came all this way to save myself? I could have left you tied up like they wanted." "Then why didn't you?" The question hung in the air, sharp and honest. He didn't have an answer. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was something he saw in her eyes that morning. Something human. Something he'd lost in himself a long time ago. He sat across from her, the silence between them heavy. The woman traced a shape in the dirt with her finger, a symbol he didn't recognize. "What's your name?" he asked finally. She hesitated. "Names are not for strangers. Then what am I?" "You're a man who doesn't know which side he stands on." That cut deep. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "You think it's easy living between both worlds? I've worked for the army, but I've seen what they do. I've seen the burning camps, the children taken. I stopped believing a long time ago." Her eyes softened, but her voice stayed cold. "Belief isn't what makes a man. What he protects does." The cowboy looked at her then, not as a prisoner, not as a mystery, but as someone who had carried pain through fire and still refused to break. He wanted to ask her what had happened, who she'd lost, but the look in her eyes warned him not to. Some stories weren't meant to be spoken aloud. As the day wore on, the heat outside eased. They stayed hidden in that hollow, sharing silence like uneasy allies. He offered her water from his canteen, and after a pause, she took it. "You said they killed your husband," he said softly. "Was that true?" She didn't look at him. He was chief of his band. They said surrender or die. He chose the river. The weight of her words sank in. "And you?" "I was taken." Her tone was flat, almost detached. "They said they'd trade me for peace. Peace never came." The cowboy's stomach twisted. He'd heard stories like that before, but hearing it from her lips was different. It made the cruelty real. "You don't have to keep running forever," he said. She gave him a small, bitter smile. "You still think freedom means stopping." Before he could answer, a sound echoed from the canyon mouth, a sharp cry followed by a gunshot. They both froze. The cowboy grabbed his rifle, motioning for her to stay low. The woman reached for her charm again, whispering something under her breath. He crept toward the edge of the hollow, peering through a crack. The riders were back, searching the lower trail. One of them dismounted, inspecting the ground. The cowboy recognized him, the same officer who had paid for the delivery. His stomach sank. "What is it?" she asked. He turned to her. "It's not just Apache riders. There are soldiers, too. They're working together." Her face darkened. "Then they've made their choice." The soldiers fanned out, rifles ready. He knew if they found the tracks leading here, they'd both be finished. He looked back at her. "If we don't move now, we're trapped." She stood, her chin lifted. "Then let's move like shadows." They slipped from the hollow and followed a narrow ledge that wound upward along the canyon wall. The climb was steep, the rocks sharp, but she moved with the sure-footed grace of someone who knew the land like her own heartbeat. The cowboy followed close behind, every step echoing with risk. Below them, voices shouted. A flash of sunlight glinted off a rifle barrel. A bullet struck the rock near his boot. He stumbled, grabbing the edge for balance. She turned and reached out, catching his hand just in time. Her grip was strong, her eyes fierce. "Don't look down," she said. He met her gaze. "You sound like you've done this before." "I have," she said quietly. And not everyone made it. They climbed higher until the ridge flattened into a narrow plateau overlooking the desert. The horizon stretched endless and wild, painted in shades of red and gold. For a brief moment it was silent again. The woman stood tall, breathing hard, the wind tugging at her hair. The cowboy looked out across the land. Beautiful, merciless, infinite. He turned to her. "If they catch us, they'll hang me for treason." She faced him, her expression unreadable. "Then you finally chose a side." Below, the sound of hoofbeats rose again, echoing through the canyons like thunder. The chase wasn't over. It had only just begun. And as the sun dipped behind the cliffs, the cowboy knew he'd crossed a line he could never step back from. Night came fast over the desert, swallowing the horizon in shades of purple and gray. The wind had cooled, but danger still hung in the air like heat off the sand. The cowboy and the Apache woman had taken shelter beneath an overhanging ledge, a shallow cave tucked into the cliffside. The fire between them burned small, its light barely enough to chase away the dark. Neither of them spoke for a long while. The silence was heavy, full of things neither dared to say. He sat polishing his rifle, his hands steady though his mind was not. He kept seeing the faces of the men chasing them, the soldiers he once rode beside, the same men who had paid him to deliver her. They'd told him it was simple work: find her, bring her in, get paid. But the longer he was near her, the less sure he was of who deserved saving. He looked across the fire at her. She sat with her knees drawn close, staring into the flames, her face caught between light and shadow. He wanted to ask what she was thinking, but her eyes made him feel like she already knew the question. Finally, she spoke. "You could still go back," she said softly. "They'll believe you were taken captive." He shook his head. "And leave you to them?" "They'd give you your life," she said. "They wouldn't give me mine." He looked down, his jaw tight. "You think I'd live easy after that?" She studied him for a moment, then turned back to the fire. "Men always think guilt is enough to make them righteous," she said. "It isn't." The words hit him hard, but he didn't argue. She wasn't trying to wound him. She was speaking truth, and he knew it. Guilt didn't make a man good. It only reminded him of what he'd already lost. When the fire died low, she stood and walked to the mouth of the cave. The stars stretched endless above the canyon, cold and sharp. "My people believe each soul belongs to the land," she said quietly. "When someone dies wrong, their spirit doesn't rest. It stays near, waiting." He rose slowly, joining her. "You think your husband's spirit's out there?" Her gaze drifted toward the ridges in the distance. "I think he's watching. I think he knows I can't join him until my chains are gone." The cowboy frowned. "You mean the men chasing us?" "I mean all of them," she said. "The ones who took our home, our rivers, our names." She turned to face him. "And the ones who look at me and see a prize instead of a person." He didn't look away. "I don't see you that way." Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes softened. "Then maybe you're different. Or maybe you just haven't had to choose yet." He didn't sleep much that night. Every sound, the cry of a coyote, the whisper of wind through the rocks, kept him half awake. When dawn came, he found her gone from the fire. Panic shot through him. He grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, heart pounding. Then he saw her near the edge of the cliff, kneeling. She wasn't running. She was tracing marks in the dust with the point of a stick. "What are you doing?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Leaving a message." "For who?" "For anyone who knows how to read it," she said. "There are eyes in this desert you don't see." He knelt beside her, trying to make sense of the lines she drew. "Looks like nothing but scratches to me. That's why you'll live," she said simply. "The men who follow us won't understand it either." He realized then she wasn't just surviving, she was fighting in her own way. Every step, every mark she left behind was part of something larger. He wondered if she had a plan to reach her people, or if she was trusting fate to lead her. By midday they were moving again, crossing a dry basin where the heat rose in shimmering waves. They shared little water and fewer words. The cowboy's mind wandered to the soldiers. If they caught him, they'd call him a traitor. If they didn't, they'd hunt her until they did. Either way, someone was going to die. As they climbed toward the next ridge, they came upon the ruins of an old mission. The walls were half collapsed, the wooden beams blackened by time and weather. He stopped at the doorway, peering inside. "Looks like someone once tried to make a home here," he said. The woman stepped in behind him, her eyes scanning the walls. "A home built on someone else's bones," she said. The priests came with crosses, the soldiers followed with guns. He walked to what was left of the altar, the stone cracked down the middle. "Seems no one wins out here," he said quietly. "No one ever does," she replied. "The land remembers," even when men pretend to forget. They found a corner still sturdy enough to rest. She gathered brush while he patched a small fire pit. The air inside smelled of old ashes. As the light faded, he saw her pause, looking toward the shadows near the wall. Someone was here, she said. Not long ago, he reached for his rifle. How can you tell? She pointed at a small pile of sage still green at the edges. That was burned yesterday. His chest tightened. Then they're close. Before she could answer, a sharp whistle echoed from outside, the kind used by scouts. The woman's eyes widened. Hide, she whispered. They moved fast, ducking behind the fallen beam. Voices followed, low and rough. The cowboy recognized one immediately, the officer from the fort. Spread out, the man ordered. She's near. The tracker says their fire burned not 20 miles back. The cowboy gritted his teeth. He'd known the officer for years. A hard man, quick to judge and slower to forgive. The kind who'd sell mercy if someone paid enough. He listened as the soldiers shuffled through the ruins, their boots scraping stone. A moment later, one of them stopped near the beam where they hid. The cowboy could see his shadow through a crack in the wood. The soldier bent down, touching the ground. Tracks, sir, he called. The officer's voice came sharp. Fresh? Looks it. The cowboy held his breath. The woman beside him was motionless, her hand gripping the knife she kept hidden in her boot. The air was thick with dust and tension. Then came another voice, a different tone, rough but not military. No need to chase ghosts, soldier. You'll only waste bullets. The officer's boots turned. Who said that? A figure stepped into view, tall and dressed in tattered hides. The cowboy recognized him from stories. A half Apache scout who once worked both sides of the border, switching loyalties like cards in a deck. You're hunting someone who doesn't want to be found, the scout said. And this desert doesn't like outsiders, the officer sneered. You've been paid to track, not to talk. Then you've already paid too much, the scout said, his eyes glinting in the firelight. The tension between them was sharp enough to cut. The cowboy stayed still, watching through the crack. The woman's face showed recognition, a flicker of old hatred. She whispered under her breath. His name is Taza. He betrayed my people. The scout's gaze shifted, scanning the ruins. For a heartbeat, the cowboy thought he'd spotted them. But instead, Taza turned back to the officer. They'll head north, he said. Toward the cliffs by Eagle Ridge. If you ride fast, maybe you'll catch them before nightfall. The officer nodded. Then we ride. Moments later, the sound of horses faded into the distance. The cowboy exhaled slowly. Why'd he lie for us? The woman's expression stayed cold. He didn't lie. He's sending them to the place where my brother's people hide. They'll kill whoever they find there. The cowboy's stomach dropped. Then we can't let that happen. She met his gaze, eyes blazing. Now you see why I said freedom costs more than one life. They waited until full dark before moving again. The desert had changed under moonlight, ghostly white sands, jagged shadows like claw marks across the ground. As they rode north, the cowboy couldn't shake the feeling that every choice he made pulled him deeper into a war that had started long before he came along. By midnight, they reached the rim of Eagle Ridge. Below, faint fires flickered in the valley. A camp. Maybe her people's. The woman's voice was low but urgent. If the soldiers reach them before sunrise, there'll be a massacre. He looked down the steep path ahead, his heart pounding. Then we go now, she nodded once. But understand this, she said. If we ride into that valley, there's no turning back. The army will call you an enemy. My people might too. He took a deep breath, gripping the reins. Guess I'll just have to earn their trust. For a long moment she studied him, her expression unreadable. Then she mounted her horse and turned toward the path. The moonlight caught her face, and for the first time, he saw something like hope there, fragile, fleeting but real. As they began their descent, the wind rose again, carrying the cries of coyotes from the far side of the ridge. Somewhere out there, the soldiers were closing in. The firelight below danced like a promise and a warning, and between them, two riders caught between worlds, rode toward a fate neither could escape. The wind tore through the narrow ridge as the cowboy and the Apache woman made their way down the steep path toward the valley. The moon was sinking behind the mountains, throwing long shadows across the rocks. The faint fires below flickered like stars fallen to earth. Somewhere among them, her people were camped, unaware of the danger that crept closer every hour. Behind them, miles away but gaining, the soldiers rode hard, their horses leaving a trail of dust that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. Every sound felt sharper, the crunch of gravel under their boots, the snort of the horses, the whisper of the wind. The cowboy could feel the weight of what was coming pressing down on his chest. He wasn't just running anymore. He was riding straight into something he didn't fully understand. She hadn't spoken much since they'd left the ruined mission. Her face was set, eyes fixed on the valley ahead, but he could see the fear beneath her calm. It wasn't for herself, it was for the people waiting below. When they reached the last bend of the ridge, she stopped suddenly, holding up her hand. The cowboy reined in his horse, watching her crouch low and scan the horizon. The moonlight glinted off her hair as she listened. Then, in a quiet voice, she said, "They're closer than I thought. We have less than an hour." He followed her gaze to the west where faint specks moved in the distance, riders no more than shadows but moving fast. He gritted his teeth. "We'll warn them. Maybe we can set up a defense." She shook her head. "You don't understand. The army's not coming to fight fair. They'll come at night, fire the camp, shoot anyone who runs. They've done it before." The cowboy's stomach turned. He'd seen that kind of raid himself, years back in the border wars. Men yelling orders, smoke rising, gunfire cutting through the dark. He'd told himself it was justice then. Now it just felt like shame. "We'll find a way," he said firmly. "But we have to move now." They spurred their horses down the slope, the trail twisting through sharp rocks and thorny brush. Twice the horses stumbled, sending stones tumbling into the dark. By the time they reached the valley floor, the air was thick with dust and tension. The Apache woman dismounted, motioning for silence. Together they led the horses on foot through the trees until they saw the campfire glow up ahead. A circle of wickiups stood in the clearing, smoke rising faintly from small fires. The scent of cedar hung in the air. Children's laughter floated softly from one side, and the low murmur of voices came from another. The cowboy felt something twist inside him. It looked like peace, the kind no one in this land got to keep for long. Before they could step forward, two shadows emerged from behind a tree, boughs drawn tight. The woman raised her hand and called out softly in Apache. The tension broke as one of the figures lowered his bow and ran to her, his face breaking into relief. It was a young man, no older than 20, his long hair tied with a strip of red cloth. He embraced her, speaking quickly in their tongue. The cowboy stood back, not wanting to intrude, but he caught fragments of words. Sister, soldiers, death. The young man's face hardened, and his eyes flicked toward the cowboy. For a moment, the air between them felt dangerous. Then the woman spoke again, her tone sharp but steady. The young man nodded reluctantly and turned to call out to the others. Men and women began to gather, some carrying rifles, others holding torches, their eyes fixed on the stranger standing beside their sister. The cowboy could feel the weight of their distrust. One of the older men stepped forward, scars cutting across his cheek. "Why is there a white man here?" he asked in a low, steady voice. The woman answered for him. "Because he chose to fight beside us, not against us." A murmur ran through the group. The old man studied the cowboy's face for a long time, then gave a short nod. "If he fights, he stays. If he lies, he dies." The cowboy met his gaze and said quietly, "Then I'll fight." The decision was made. The camp shifted into motion, a storm of quiet preparation. The young men gathered their rifles and knives. The women packed supplies, dousing fires to keep the smoke low. The cowboy helped where he could, setting up barricades of logs near the open edge of the camp. He felt the strange unity that comes before battle, a mix of fear and purpose, the kind that binds strangers together faster than friendship ever could. The Apache woman moved among her people like a flame, calm, fierce, unshakable. He watched her tie her hair back, sling a rifle over her shoulder, and speak to each family. She wasn't just warning them, she was leading them. As the night deepened, they took positions around the camp. The cowboy crouched beside her near a fallen tree. The valley was eerily quiet. Even the crickets had gone silent. Far off, he thought he could hear faint hoofbeats echoing through the canyon. "They'll come from the west," she whispered. "They always come from the wind's side. It hides the sound of their approach," he nodded. "How many do you think?" "Too many," she said. "But we don't need to kill them all. Just stop them long enough for the families to escape through the eastern pass." He glanced at her, the moonlight touching her face. "And what about us?" Her eyes stayed fixed on the ridge. "We hold them as long as we can." The minutes dragged like hours. The cowboy's hands were steady, but his heart beat hard. He thought about the fort, the officer, the bounty he'd never collect. He thought about the woman beside him, The way she'd looked at him when she said freedom had a price. He realized now what she'd meant. Then faintly at first came the sound of horses. The ground began to tremble beneath them. The woman motioned for silence. The cowboy peered through the trees and saw movement. Dark shapes cutting through the brush, rifles glinting under the moon. "The soldiers were here, get ready," she whispered. The first gunshot split the night like thunder. A bullet whined past his ear and buried itself in a log. The cowboy fired back, the rifle kicking hard against his shoulder. Chaos exploded across the valley. Men shouting, horses screaming, flames bursting as torches were thrown. The soldiers came in fast, but the Apaches met them with fire and fury. The cowboy moved through the smoke, reloading, firing, ducking for cover. He saw the young man, the woman's brother, rush forward, shouting orders. The woman herself fought like someone with nothing left to lose. She fired with precision, every shot measured, her face streaked with ash and sweat. A cannon blast shattered one of the wickiups, sending sparks into the night sky. The screams that followed tore through the cowboy's chest. He turned, searching for her. She was already running toward the fire, pulling a child from the wreckage. He sprinted after her, covering her as she carried the little one to safety. But the soldiers were closing in. He could see the officer now, mounted on a black horse shouting commands. His voice was cold and certain. "Take the woman alive," he yelled. "Shoot the rest." The cowboy froze. They weren't just here to destroy, they wanted her. Rage rose in him like fire. He raised his rifle, sighting the officer through the smoke. But before he could pull the trigger, the woman grabbed his arm. "Not yet," she hissed. "If he dies now, the others won't stop. They'll burn everything. So what then?" he demanded. Her eyes blazed. "We draw them away." She turned and ran toward the eastern ridge. The cowboy cursed and followed. Behind them, the camp burned bright against the dark. Gunfire echoed like thunder rolling across the hills. They sprinted through the brush, the sound of horses growing louder behind them. Bullets struck the ground at their heels. The cowboy fired blindly over his shoulder. The woman stumbled once, caught herself, and kept running. Ahead, the path split, one trail leading deeper into the cliffs, the other toward the river. "This way," she shouted, veering left. They plunged into the narrow gorge where the walls rose high and close. The noise of pursuit echoed like ghosts behind them. At last they reached a clearing, a dead end surrounded by rock. The woman stopped, breathing hard. "We'll climb," she said. "It's the only way." He looked up. The cliff face was nearly vertical, slick with dust. "We won't make it before they reach us." She turned to him, eyes fierce. "Then we make them bleed before they do." The cowboy checked his rifle, only 2 bullets left. He handed her his revolver. "You'll need this more than me." She hesitated, then took it. The sound of hooves grew louder, echoing through the gorge. The first shadows appeared at the mouth of the trail. The cowboy and the woman took their positions behind the rocks, ready. In that moment, time seemed to stop. The desert wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the smell of gunpowder and smoke. The cowboy glanced at her, dust on her face, eyes sharp as steel, and he knew this was where everything would break. The riders burst into the clearing. Muzzles flashed, the air filled with gunfire. The woman's brother appeared suddenly from the shadows behind them, his rifle blazing, shouting for them to climb. The cowboy fired his last shot, the bullet striking a soldier square in the chest. The recoil nearly knocked him off balance. He turned just as the woman stumbled, hit in the shoulder. He caught her before she fell, pulling her behind the rocks. Blood darkened her sleeve, but she didn't cry out. "Go," she said through clenched teeth. "You have to finish it." He shook his head. "Not without you." The sound of horses closed in again, hooves pounding, voices shouting through the smoke. He could see the officer now, his pistol raised, his face lit by firelight. The cowboy tightened his grip on his rifle and whispered, "Then we end this together." And as the flames rose around them and the canyon filled with the roar of battle, the story of 2 souls caught between war and mercy reached the edge of its breaking point. The canyon was a storm of fire and dust. Gunfire echoed from every wall and smoke curled toward the fading moon. The cowboy's arms burned as he dragged the Apache woman to cover, his heart pounding with every breath. Her blood soaked his shirt, warm and frighteningly steady. She was still awake, but her skin had gone pale. The soldiers' shouts drew closer, their boots clattering on the rock. He knew they couldn't hold much longer. The woman's brother, crouched behind another boulder, called out in Apache. She answered weakly, her voice breaking. He shouted again, desperate, before turning his rifle toward the soldiers charging through the narrow pass. A bullet struck his shoulder, spinning him around, but he didn't fall. He fired back until the rifle jammed. The cowboy crawled over, took the rifle from him and reloaded with shaking hands. He'd fought before, but never like this, never for something that mattered beyond himself. When he looked up, the officer on the black horse had ridden into the clearing. His coat was torn, his face streaked with dust, but his eyes were cold as ice. "Stand down!" the man shouted. "You're surrounded. No one's leaving this canyon alive." The cowboy rose halfway, rifle steady, his breath ragged. "You said the same thing at the fort once," he called back. "And you were wrong then too," the officer sneered. "You don't know what you're protecting. She's a rebel. She's cost more lives than you'll ever save." The cowboy shook his head. "You're the one counting lives like coins." The officer fired first. The bullet grazed the cowboy's arm, ripping his sleeve. He fired back, the shot ringing through the night. The horse reared and the officer toppled to the ground, his pistol flying from his hand. For a moment, silence fell across the canyon. Then chaos broke loose again as soldiers surged forward. The cowboy turned to the woman. "Can you walk?" She nodded faintly. "Just go. I'll slow you down." "Not a chance," he said, pulling her up. They stumbled together toward the back of the gorge, where the rocks rose into a steep climb. The woman's brother covered them, firing until his last bullet was spent. When the gun clicked empty, he drew his knife and charged straight into the dust, yelling in his native tongue. The sound of his cry cut through the chaos like a flame. The cowboy didn't look back. He half-carried the woman up the rocks, every step tearing at his legs. The canyon below was a blur of firelight and movement. When they reached the ledge, he set her down behind a boulder and turned to see the soldiers scattering. The officer had regained his footing and was ordering a retreat, perhaps realizing the cost had grown too high. The echo of hooves faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence too heavy to bear. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The cowboy could hear only the wind sighing through the canyon. The woman leaned against the rock, her breathing shallow but steady. "It's over," he whispered. Though even as he said it, he wasn't sure it was true. She gave a small, tired smile. "No, it's never over. Not for people like me." He sank down beside her, his body trembling from exhaustion. "You saved them," he said. "Your people got away." Her eyes drifted toward the dark horizon. "Maybe, but too many didn't. My brother—" Her voice faltered. "He was all I had left." The cowboy swallowed hard. "He bought us time. He knew what he was doing." She looked at him then. Really looked, as if seeing him for the first time not as a stranger but as a man who had chosen to stand on her side when it mattered most. "You could have left me back there," she said softly. "Why didn't you?" He thought about it for a moment. "Because you were right. A man isn't what he believes in. He's what he protects." Her eyes glistened, not with tears but with something deeper. Understanding perhaps, or sorrow that had finally found peace. She leaned her head back against the rock and closed her eyes. The cowboy wrapped his coat around her shoulders. Dawn was breaking now, the first thin streaks of gold cutting across the sky. The fires in the valley below were dying, replaced by the quiet hum of morning wind. When the sun rose, the land looked different, softer somehow. The cowboy helped her to her feet. They stood together on the ridge, looking down at the smoke curling through the canyon. "What will you do now?" he asked. She took a slow breath. "There's a place east of here, a river where the elders once hid after the raids. I'll go there. Start again." He nodded, though part of him ached at the thought of her leaving. "And you?" she asked. He looked toward the west, where the line of the mountains met the horizon. "Can't go back to the fort. They'll hang me for treason." "Then ride south," she said. "Find the border towns. Men disappear there all the time." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I don't want to disappear." The woman turned to him, her dark hair stirring in the wind. "Then live for something that matters. You don't owe the past your life anymore." Her words struck deep. For the first time in years, he felt like the world ahead of him wasn't just another job or another road. It was something he could choose. They spent the rest of the day tending to her wound, cleaning what little they could near a spring that trickled from the rocks. He tore strips from his shirt to bandage her arm. She didn't flinch, though her face stayed pale. When she spoke again, her voice was soft. "You remind me of someone I knew once. A man who thought mercy was weakness, until it saved him," he smiled. "Maybe that's all any of us are trying to learn." By evening, the smoke from the valley had thinned to nothing. They buried her brother near the ridge, marking the spot with a circle of stones. She sang something low and haunting, a song without words that seemed to carry across the desert like wind through the grass. When she finished, she stood for a long time staring at the horizon. The cowboy stayed beside her, saying nothing. As the stars came out, she turned to him. "When the night falls, we'll part ways," she said. The soldiers will keep searching and you'll be safer if we're not together. He wanted to protest, but he saw the truth in her eyes. She didn't belong to him and she never would. She belonged to the land, to her people, to the fire that had kept her alive through everything. When the time came, they rode together to the edge of the plateau. The desert stretched out below them, vast and quiet. She stopped her horse and looked at him one last time. "Thank you," she said simply, "for cutting my chains, for staying when you could have left." He tipped his hat, his throat tight. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," she said. "That's why I'll remember you." She turned her horse toward the east and rode off into the dawn, her figure growing smaller against the golden light. The cowboy watched until she vanished beyond the ridge. Then he looked west, where the land was open and the air still carried the smell of smoke and wild sage. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel lost. He rode until the sun stood high above the plains. Somewhere behind him, the river glistened where her people had gone to rebuild. He hoped she had found peace, or at least a place where peace could begin. By the time he reached the border trail, the wind had shifted. It carried a whisper through the dry grass, like a voice he almost recognized. He smiled to himself and murmured, "You were right, Apache woman. Freedom ain't given, it's chosen." He touched the edge of her leather charm still tied to his saddle horn. It had become his compass now, a reminder of the dawn when he had freed her and found himself in the same act. The desert stretched wide and endless before him, golden and quiet, waiting for the next story to begin. The cowboy rode on beneath the open sky, no longer hunted, no longer bound, carrying the memory of the woman who had once said she'd rather die than be his, and instead taught him what it truly meant to live free.